Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled CoC 101, A Guide for PHAs. I am Marcy Thompson from the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, which is the program office within HUD that administers its homeless assistance grants. Today, I will be presenting with the assistance of Irene Pijuan of the Corporation for Supportive Housing, a HUD TA provider. This session is designed to provide you with an overview of the Continuum of Care, or CoC. We'll go over its context, goals, and importance. We plan to provide you with some baseline knowledge of the CoC concept and key principles for effective continuum of care planning and collaboration. We'll review the purpose of a CoC with some history as to why it was developed and its evolution, and to provide you with some information as you start thinking about further developing your relationship with your local CoC. The term continuum of care is commonly used to describe a funding stream, a group of people, and a geographic area. The CoC Program Interim Rule defines continuum of care as follows. The group organized to carry out the responsibilities required under the CoC Program Interim Rule, including the setting of community goals around ending homelessness, measuring performance towards these goals as well as performance of providers, overseeing HMIS implementation and operation, and providing guidance around coordination of homeless housing and services across the geographic area. A CoC is composed of representatives of various organizations listed on this slide, including nonprofit homeless service providers, faith-based organizations, businesses, advocates, public housing agencies, school districts, etc. HUD places a high value on the extent in which all of these types of organizations are part of the CoC membership to the extent that they are represented within the geographic area and are available to participate. I'd like to take a moment to walk you through the regulatory, statutory, and programmatic context for the CoC. For years, the CoC concept was something that was administered through annual funding competitions with policies and requirements set forth through a Notice of Funding Availability. However, the enactment of the HEARTH Act in 2009, which amended the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, codified this process and consolidated the three separate McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Programs previously funded by HUD into a single grant program known as the Continuum of Care Program. The major provisions of the CoC Program Interim Rule relate to how to establish and operate a CoC, how to apply for funds, and eligible costs allowable under the program. The purpose of the CoC program is to promote a community-wide commitment to the goals of ending homelessness, quickly rehousing homeless individuals and families, promoting access to and effective utilization of mainstream resources, and optimizing self-sufficiency. To accomplish these goals, CoC program funds may be used to support activities under 5 primary program components: permanent housing, which includes permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, transitional housing, supportive services only, HMIS, and for HUD-designated high-performing communities only, homelessness prevention. The CoC is the group of people that takes on coordination of homeless services and homelessness prevention activities across a specified geographic area. This group applies for the funds available under the CoC program and works to coordinate the various streams of homeless funding and mainstream funding that are available in the community. Funds for the CoC program are administered through an annual competition. The CoC designates a single organization, known as the collaborative applicant, to complete an annual application to HUD for funding to address the needs of the geographic area encompassed by the CoC. Through the application, the CoC also reports on the progress of previously funded projects and provides information about the needs and structure for addressing homelessness. Continuum of care planning is a critical component of communities' efforts to end homelessness. CoC planning provides communities with an opportunity to step back, critically assess capacity, and develop solutions to move homeless people toward permanent housing and self-sufficiency, as well as helping communities to develop a common vision and a set of common goals. Historically, homeless services have been fragmented, but the Continuum of Care planning process helps providers identify ways of coordinating and linking resources to avoid duplication and facilitate movement toward permanent housing and self-sufficiency. Continuum of Care planning ideally involves stakeholders outside of the traditional homeless system, with the goal of educating these stakeholders and getting them to buy in and become part of the solution. The CoC planning process can be explained as a cycle, with many activities taking place on a regular and annual basis. HUD requires annual data collection and reporting by CoCs, including point-in-time count, which is required biennially, a housing inventory count, annual homelessness assessment report, and the annual progress report. Using this collected data, CoCs are asked to conduct a gaps analysis and establish a community process for prioritizing response to identified gaps. CoCs then develop strategies to address gaps in their homeless response system by linking gaps to resources, developing an action plan, and developing timeframes. With a strategic plan in place, CoCs then move to implementation, including oversight, monitoring, and accountability. So who are we talking about when we talk about homeless persons? HUD's definition of homeless includes 4 categories of homelessness: literally homeless, imminent risk of homelessness, homeless under other federal statutes, and fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. On June 10, 2013, HUD issued PIH Notice 2013-15 to provide PHAs with strategies for documenting and housing individuals and families experiencing homelessness through the Housing Choice Voucher Program and public housing. As mentioned in that notice, PIH is adopting only a portion of this new definition. This is for reporting purposes only and is narrowed to the following 2 categories. Category 1 is literally homeless, which is defined as an individual or family who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And Category 4, which is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, which refers to any individual or family who is fleeing or attempting to flee a domestic violence situation, has no other residence, and lacks the resources or support networks to obtain other permanent housing. Now, Irene will walk us through the various components of a homeless system. Irene?
Thanks, Marcy. Now that we know a bit more about the purpose and goals of a CoC, let's talk about the parts of a homeless system. When we say homeless system, we are referring to all the housing opportunities and supportive service opportunities available in a community to persons identified as homeless or at risk of homelessness. Homeless systems may look very different from community to community, but all have the same fundamental parts to address community homelessness: prevention, outreach, emergency shelter, transitional housing, permanent housing, which includes permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, and supportive services. We'll talk about each of these components in more detail on the next few slides. But first, let's talk about coordinated assessment. The model we see here is pre the adoption of coordinated assessment. The HARTH Act requires communities to implement a coordinated assessment system process designed to coordinate program participant intake, assessment, and provision of referrals. This requirement is forcing communities to examine how homelessness flows into their system and identify necessary changes to be made as a part of system redesign. Most CoCs have yet to implement a coordinated assessment system and are still operating in a way that assesses persons as they present at a particular project. Persons experiencing homelessness are responsible for navigating the system on their own, and projects simply ask, is this household eligible for my program? Not, is this household eligible for any programs in my homeless system? Without coordinated assessment, systems tend to be project-centric, meaning projects decide whether to serve a homeless household in their project but take no responsibility for providing assistance beyond their own project. Under this model, intake forms and assessment processes are unique to each organization or small subgroup of programs. They do not necessarily ensure the best match between a household and the program in which they enter and the services received, and there's uneven knowledge around the homeless system about available housing and service interventions. Communities are being encouraged to move away from this linear system model and move towards a system that matches persons to the intervention that matches their needs and gets people into permanent housing more quickly. Under a coordinated assessment system, an intake worker would instead consider what housing and service strategy would be best for this household. The CoC and its projects are collectively responsible for finding the right type and amount of assistance for each person, and the process is seamless, easily accessible, and consistent regardless of where the person asks for help. Under a coordinated assessment system model, the system is client-centric and system-driven, has standard forms and assessment processes used by every program within the system for every client. It provides a coordinated referral process across the CoC and is accessible and has accessible information about available housing and service interventions in the CoC evenly across the system. No matter the exact model used by a community, the components of the homeless system still remain the same under coordinated assessment. Let's talk about these components in more detail. Prevention. Prevention activities aim to assist individuals and households at imminent risk of becoming homeless to maintain their housing through stabilization services and/or emergency financial assistance. Prevention also encompasses discharge planning in coordination with mainstream agencies such as health, mental health, foster care, and the justice system to ensure that these agencies are helping clients locate and secure housing upon discharge from the institution. Prevention should be an integral part of every community's continuum. However, it is difficult to actually predict who will become homeless versus who would be able to avoid homelessness without intervention. Homeless prevention funding sources include Emergency Solutions Grant and limiting opportunities under the CoC program. Outreach and assessment services are critical for identifying and addressing the immediate needs of persons experiencing homelessness, such as food, clothing, blankets, and medical care, and providing a link to ongoing support. Outreach, intake, and assessment tend to identify an individual or family's service needs and housing needs, and then link them with the appropriate housing or service resource. An example would be an outreach service would include an outreach team to homeless youth or single adults, or it might include a special mobile health care unit or mental health care workers. Intake and assessment services could include workers at an emergency shelter or in transitional housing who assess an individual or family's needs beyond the need for immediate shelter to link the individual or family with needed housing and services support. Emergency shelters are intended to provide a safe, secure, temporary place for individuals and households to reside while they seek more permanent housing and supportive services that will facilitate access to permanent housing options. Emergency shelters are safe and decent alternatives to the streets. Examples include emergency shelters for homeless families with children and emergency shelters for homeless single adults. A locality might decide to establish a triage point to assess service-related needs of homeless families and individuals, such as homeless individuals with HIV or AIDS or mental illness, in order to make an appropriate emergency placement. The next component on our list is supportive services. Many CoCs use mainstream supportive services, those not just for homeless people, but available to the entire community. Examples include job readiness, benefits counseling, landlord mediation, housing search and placement, as well as several mental health services. Transitional housing is limited to the length of stay. Transitional housing is limited to a length of stay of up to 24 months. Supportive services aim to help people develop the skills necessary for permanent housing. An example of transitional housing is housing for homeless women in recovery with their children. In light of the coordinated assessment implementation and HEARTH performance measurements asking CoCs to reduce the length of homelessness, the idea of retooling transitional housing is emerging as a hot topic around the country. Transitional housing stays range from 6 months, which allow programs to serve households in a more cost-effective way, to 2 years, which could create a backlog in the homeless system, with households staying homeless longer and costing significantly more than necessary. In many communities, people currently enter transitional housing from either emergency shelter or another transitional housing program, adding to the length of stay and length of time homeless. Transitional housing can be very effective for certain populations such as domestic violence victims, unaccompanied youth, and persons with substance abuse disorders. But data shows that for anyone else, there is probably another resource that would be equally, if not more effective, and not as expensive. Communities are being encouraged to examine their options. Permanent housing. The principal challenge facing communities in preventing and eradicating homelessness continues to be centered on the lack of permanent affordable housing. As such, it is critical that Continuums work with the broader housing and community development community and coordinate long-term planning efforts. There are two types of permanent housing under the CoC program: permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. Rapid rehousing assistance aims to help individuals or families who are homeless move as quickly as possible into permanent housing and achieve stability in that housing through a combination of rental assistance and supportive services. Communities have demonstrated and research has shown that rapid rehousing is a valuable strategy for quickly transitioning such individuals and families directly from shelter into permanent housing with needed and appropriate support. To sustain rapid rehousing as a valuable community tool for ending homelessness, the Emergency Solutions Grant Program and the CoC program have both included rapid rehousing and as an eligible form of assistance. Most households today become homeless from financial crisis and have lived in an independent permanent housing prior to becoming homeless, and as such, they can generally return and remain stably housed with limited assistance. Homelessness is associated with a host of negative outcomes that can be minimized by limiting the amount of time people experience it. By helping homeless households return to permanent housing as soon as possible, communities have been able to reduce the length of time people remain in homeless shelters. This opens beds for others who really need them and reduces the public and personal costs of homelessness. HUD funding of supportive housing is for homeless persons with disabilities, primarily serving individuals and members of their household who have serious mental illnesses, chronic substance abuse problems, physical disabilities, or AIDS and related diseases. Permanent supportive housing can be provided through tenant, project, or sponsor-based assistance in multifamily structures or scattered site apartments. Now I'll turn it back to Marcy to discuss a little bit more about how PHAs and CoCs can partner.
Thanks, Irene. Now that we know a little more about CoCs and homeless systems, let's take some time to identify ways to consider partnering with a CoC. PHAs are already doing great work all over the country, and all PHA efforts to end homelessness are enhanced when implemented in partnership with other organizations. PHA resources are precious, and we encourage you to work closely with CoCs to identify opportunities to use them to leverage others. Each of the ideas in these next slides is being implemented somewhere in the country, and they are possible to replicate. Homelessness and wait lists don't mix well. PHA's waiting lists can be a barrier to individuals and families experiencing homelessness, having access to public housing and HCV programs. PHAs can take a variety of actions to reduce these barriers and increase access to homeless persons in their programs. These include establishing a preference in their admissions policies. Homeless preferences are an effective tool that PHAs can use to reduce the time people are homeless, increase utilization rates, and increase housing stability. CoCs can help PHAs by linking them to partners who provide housing-focused services such as housing searches and case management. PIH Notice 2013-15 provides additional information about how to establish a homeless preference. Permanent supportive housing is a scarce resource and should be targeted to serve those who need it most. Some tenants find that after years in permanent supportive housing, they don't need the same level of service that they once did, but they still need the housing subsidy. For example, a formerly homeless person may have entered a PSH program 5 years ago and at the time needed intensive counseling and other supportive services. However, over time he is stabilized and no longer needs that level of support. However, he remains in the permanent supportive housing program because he cannot increase his income and he continues to need the affordable housing. PHAs are responding to this need by providing a variety of resources to help tenants who want to move on while freeing up apartments for those waiting for access to permanent supportive housing. A PHA could establish a preference that would allow for a move-up strategy in partnership with their local CoC, in which the CoC would identify persons or families in permanent supportive housing that meet this criteria and would like to volunteer to leave the permanent supportive housing program in favor of another affordable housing option. A PHA could then provide a public housing unit and/or voucher to those persons who volunteer to exit permanent supportive housing and enter a public housing unit or use a voucher. More information on this move-up strategy and working with CoCs to implement it will be coming soon. Many homeless people are screened out of affordable housing because of past behaviors, including criminal history or repeated convictions. PHAs that want to break down barriers for people who are stuck in homelessness can reevaluate their screening criteria. It may be valuable for PHAs to review statutory and regulatory provisions that bar admissions to persons with criminal histories versus those provisions that require PHAs to have policies in place regarding exclusions versus others that simply give PHAs the discretion to exclude people with certain backgrounds. PHAs should acknowledge those discretionary policies that may be thwarting other best efforts to house homeless people and consider how they can better screen in this population. Exercising this discretion may be particularly worthwhile for prospective tenants who are working with a service provider and will benefit from the stability of housing to start or continue their rehabilitation. Navigating multi-layered application and lease-up processes can be very challenging when living outside in a shelter or in a car. PHA staff sometimes spends hours going back and forth with applicants to fill in missing information and/or track down related documentation. Why not train a service provider about application requirements and ask them to help? PHAs can customize agreements with service partners so that they can assist the applicants they refer with collecting supporting documentation and submitting complete applications. This partnership reduces time wasted on no-shows and ultimately reduces the amount of time people are homeless. When PHAs have relationships with service providers, they can ask their partners to help them identify and address housing stability challenges before a problem leads to an eviction. Evictions from public housing cost money and staff time, run counter to an organization's housing mission, and can leave families with little or no housing alternatives. Evictions can be especially destabilizing events for families with children. Evictions from public housing can be somewhat easier to prevent than those in the private market when PHAs are working closely with service providers. There are many ways PHAs might attempt to lower eviction rates while protecting the safety or well-being of all tenants. At the heart of a strong eviction prevention program is regular communication between property management and support service staff. By establishing a frequent, regular in-person or telephone check-in, PHAs and their partners can identify issues before they escalate. Other promising practices include connecting applicants with security deposit assistance to reduce delays in lease-up and using project-based vouchers to spur the development of supportive housing. Attaching vouchers to buildings supports the creation of supportive housing for extremely low-income households who need supportive services in order to remain in housing. Project basing helps owners and service providers serve highly vulnerable people by pairing subsidies with services. When large percentages of units or entire buildings are assisted, service providers have economies of scale in their service delivery and are able to assign staff to work on site, which provides enhanced opportunities for engagement. Having a regular staff presence also helps to create positive milieu in buildings and reduces some formerly homeless individuals' tendencies to isolate in their new apartments. PHAs that project base a portion of their HGVs enjoy many benefits of their investments. Project-basing vouchers for supportive housing accomplishes many PHA goals while serving the same number of low-income households as tenant-based vouchers. Finally, keep on the lookout for additional guidance and webinars related to CoC and PHA partnerships. For more information about HUD's homeless assistance programs, go to www.hudhre.info. Thank you.